It's time for the Double Stop with Brian Sword.
You take 'em all, the man.
Welcome to the Double Stop podcast. I'm Brian Sword. This week, we've got producer Max Norman. If you don't know who he is, well, I guarantee you've heard his work. He's done a boatload of Ozzy records, he's done a bunch of Megadeth records, and he's done one of my personal favorite records, Lynch Mob, Wicked Sensation. We go through his entire career, he's got lots of great stories, and let's get right to it. I always start the same way. Where were you born, and what kind of musical family did you grow up in?
I was born in Harrogate in Yorkshire, and when I was about 3, my family moved to the Midlands in England, a town called Kettering, which is where I grew up. My grandmother was a concert pianist, among other things, and my mother was also an excellent pianist, although she very rarely performed. So it did come from quite a good musical background. And I lived in Kettering until I was about 19, and then I answered an advert in the Melody Maker, or it could have been the New Musical Express, not sure which one, but I've been doing I've been in a couple of bands anyway, but I'd also been doing some live mixing for bands, and I did do a couple of shows with the original Skid Row from Ireland with Gary Moore and Brendan Shields and Noel Bridgman, which was obviously nothing to do with the later Skid Row that happened in the US.
Of course, yeah. And how was Gary at that point?
Gary Moore was 18 and absolutely probably playing better than he ever played later, I think. Absolutely astonished. He was. They were playing very fast, highly technical rock, which in those days was was just about coming into fashion a little bit, but a very fast, highly technical. Then they would do Stormy Monday and stuff like that. But his guitar playing was just unfathomable to me, actually. And I just bought an old, I think it was a 59 Les Paul Special, and I took it over there, and it was the first time, and he was playing it. It was at a town called Wellingborough. It's about 12 miles or 8 miles from my hometown, and I was in the dressing room with him, and he was trying out a bunch of different guitars, and there were a bunch of people there, and he tried out this guitar that I bought, and I realized then that most of the sound and the character of the guitar is really in the fingers of the player and not in the guitar at all. And that was a real eye-opener for me as well, and I was amazed by what he was playing. He was just playing some unbelievable stuff. I don't think he ever played as good as he was playing then. And I don't mean that to be detrimental. I just he never seemed to. He developed more into a blues player, and he stopped playing a lot of that fast stuff, I think. And he always had that same fantastic tone, but some of the stuff that he played when I first saw him was just mind-blowingly good.
And are you talking about, like, because his early solo records were all pretty hard rock? Now, are you saying that it was when he transitioned into blues he was not playing as well, or is it just because whatever it was at that point in his life, he was so dedicated that's where he
I think
peaked?
that's. I mean, I feel bad saying that because obviously he's a great artist, but when I saw him then, it never blew me away after that as much as when I first saw him, and he never seemed to play that same kind of stuff again. This was very technical, almost jazz rock that he was playing. And I think he got a little more mainstream after that. And I was never that happy with his records. I always thought he missed the mark a little bit. And I sound terrible. I sound very critical, but I'm just that's just the way I perceived it,
So what did you do after playing with Gary?
I didn't play with him. I did the sound with him a couple of times. And
I see.
In those days, it was very difficult to get a band going, of course. Well, like it isn't, anytime. But There was a lot of problems trying to get equipment, trying to get a van, trying to get gigs. It was just a lot of problems. So I actually took an advert for a sound engineer in Germany, in Nuremberg. These guys were looking for a sound engineer. It was a band called Wind. There was actually a fairly big band in Germany at the time. They were kind of like a moody blues band. And
Okay.
so I went out there and did that for some months. I remember the PA at the time was a WEM PA, Watkins Electronic Music. It was WEM. It was the biggest PA I'd seen. They had these stacks of 4 different kinds of drivers with the horns on top. It was the first time I'd seen any of that stuff. And the console was actually 3 audio masters wired up for balanced microphones. But so I had 15 channels out front with that particular band, which was pretty state of the art at the time. I guess that would have been 1972.
And at this point, did you have any training, or was it strictly that you taught yourself kind of and talked your way into these positions?
I never had any training of any of this stuff. I'm fortunate that I got good musicality, and I've got decent ears, and it all just came pretty naturally. So I never really bothered to do any formal training. Although I read a lot of books, a lot of audio magazines, and after this was lucky enough to work for TFA Electrosound for about 4 or 5 years, and worked with some excellent engineers who are still out on the road, Mick Whelan and Jeff Benson and a bunch of guys that would do the real big bands. Mick Whelan did Robin Trower for a long time. He's still around, he's still doing stuff, he's still a big out front guy. A lot of those guys were very beneficial because I could see what they were doing. They would give me tips. And doing live sound, live sound is pretty hard. It's a lot harder, I think, than studio stuff, or at least it's a lot harder to get a good result,
Yeah, for sure. And you never know what you're going to get any given night when you show up.
No, I mean, I always remember one day, when I first went to America, I joined TFA in England, or it was Electrosound at that time, run by Ricky Farr, whose brother was a famous boxer. And I came to America on the first time I came to America was very shortly after I joined that company, and I was put onto the PA crew for Robin Trower. And I came to America, and Robin Trower was doing a 60-40 co-headline with Jethro Tull. And that show was enormous. The second show I did in the US was Shea Stadium. This was just a huge step up, as previously, after I came back from Germany, I worked for a band called Sparrow for a while, which was a 5-part harmony band that won England's New Faces many times, and those the gigs we did with them were maybe 1,000 seaters, 2,000 seaters, all up and down England. We did lots and lots of shows, and a lot of them were working men's clubs, Friday night, Saturday night, full of miners or iron workers and that kind of thing. But they were a very popular band, so that really wasn't too bad. It was quite good fun. And we did a bunch of shows at the BBC and Top of the Pops a couple of times and stuff like that. So that was all quite interesting too, trying to make sense of all that stuff. I was a sound guy for those guys for, I should say, probably about a year and a half. And then I got offered this job with Electrosound. Also, before this, I'd done some other stuff. I was the keyboard roadie for the Baker Gurvitz Army with Ginger Baker and Paul Gurvitz. And that was quite interesting. I think it was I was working for, I can't remember now. But so I did do a lot of all-round stuff. I worked for bands and I worked for different stuff. And I did a lot of European tours with TFA Electrosound. I did Liza Minnelli. I did, it just sounds like a big name drop list, but it's all kind of interesting stuff. I did about 5 shows with 5 tours in Europe with Uriah Heep. And who else I'm trying to think of? Little Feat with Tower of Power Horns. That was the last tour before Lowell George died.
Oh wow!
I was very lucky. I got to work with some great guys. Weather Report with Jaco Pastorius and.
Really? How is he?
Oh, Jaco is insane. I'll tell you, there's a good story about that. There's Jaco and what's his name? The keyboard player actually died recently. Oh, I can't remember his name. Zawinul, Joe Zawinul. And I remember we were in Munich. We'd just done a show in Munich, and the next morning I was sitting in the restaurant with a couple of the other crew, and right behind us they were doing some magazine interviews with Weather Report, because they're very big. They were very big in Europe, and they did get very big at the time. This was doing the Mr. Gone album they were performing at the time. That had just come out.
Right.
And I remember hearing the guy saying, we were listening to them doing their interviews. I remember hearing, first of all, that he was interviewing Joe Zawinul, and he said, Joe, so who do you think is the best keyboard player in the world? And Joe looked at him and said, well, that's very simple. He said, obviously I am. So we kind of smoked about that and thought, well, and you know what? I sat there and I thought about it. I thought, you know what? He's probably right. The guy is probably right. That guy was, I mean, just this is an unbelievable band. I mean, they play stuff that you couldn't follow it. I mean, it would just be like unbelievable.
Oh yeah, it was another planet.
And so that was an incredible experience. And then Jaco came and sat down, and they did him with an interview, and they said the same thing to him. They said, Jaco, who do you think's the best bass player in the world? And he said, well, obviously I am. And I sat there and I just laughed. And again, I thought to myself, you know what? He's probably right. He probably is. I mean, he is absolutely astonishing. So was Joe Zawinul. That whole band was absolutely astonishing. So I was very lucky. I got to work with a lot of great people. And I was out on the road there for about 7 years touring. Did Queen, did the Eagles, did lots and lots of people. Not necessarily mixing, of course, but rigging PA speakers, all that kind of stuff. Just doing everything that was out there to do,
I would imagine that doing that, there's going to be two things that are going to happen. One, you're working with a hugely wide range of artists, so all kinds of different styles. So that training ground is going to be great. And then a massive network. Like, you're getting to know hundreds of artists here that you can later work with.
Yeah, I mean, you hope there's going to be a network. That network is maybe a little more imaginary than people think. I mean, the music business is really quite insular. I think people love to think that, everybody knows everybody else and people call each other all the time. It's not really very much like that to me. It hasn't been like that to me. I've never really found it to be a huge network. Although, of course, many of these things come back, and you do see people again, and you do get to work with them again. So it does happen. Yeah, it does happen a little bit, but I don't think it's as prevalent as people might imagine. It certainly helped me out a little bit. At the end of touring, I got a bit fed up with loading 40-footers and getting my head banged against the lighting truss and stuff like that. And then actually before I move on, I did come over to America and join TFA Electric Sound in America, and I was the Tubes live engineer for 2 years. That was just an astonishing thing as well, because there was about 20, there'd be like 23 people on stage, a lot of mics, a lot of stuff going on like that. So that was a great show, and I used to love them because people would literally walk out. They'd get so offended, which was marvelous, I thought. But yeah, I mean,
awesome. And how old would you have been around then?
Well, I tell people one thing and I'm really another. But actually, I was born in '53. So I'm actually 60 now, but a very youthful 60.
Of course.
Of course. So at that point, I would have been, we're talking about the Tubes. I finished working with the Tubes, I believe, around 1978, maybe 79. I'm kind of guessing. I went into the studio at Rich Farm. I went into the studio in 1980. my friend Frank Andrews had a studio at Ridge Farm, and the equipment was being leased to him by a guy, and the guy was taking half the money, and it basically was kind of, he worked out that it would be better for him to invest in equipment and put it in. And I was a good friend of Frank's. Frank was a lighting guy also for TFA Electrosound, Frank Andrews. His brother, Tony Andrews, was the mastermind behind the turbo sound system that is still sold out in England, still used by a lot of people. He formed a turbo sound actually down on the same premises at Ridge Farm. So I had been down there a few times, checking out the turbo sound, which Electrosound started to use to some extent, and weighing in on some of the measurements and some of the improvements that could be made with it. And so it was a sort of a natural fit for me to say to Frank, well, I'll come in there and, I'll come in and put your studio in if you make me the resident engineer. So he goes, okay, that sounds like a good plan. So we bought, I think, the second SSL 4000 series console in England. The first one went into the Manor up in Oxfordshire, which was Richard Branson's place. This was the second one in there. That was a great thing because it was there were only a few of them in England at the time, so it was a very modern console. Had a lot of great things to it. Had automation and automated punching and all kinds of dandy things. So after we put that in, that studio started to take off a bit. The first session I did in there was Bad Company. Rough Diamond, which was a bit of an ill-fated record as the band was sort of kind of breaking up at the time. There's still a few tracks around from that record. The record's still around, of course, but yeah, that was a notable record. Paul Rodgers, of course, singing, Mick Rouse playing guitar, Boz Burrell on drums, Boz Burrell on bass, Simon Kirke on drums. That was, of course, a great thing to be sitting around there and listening to these guys.
Yeah, no
so
kidding.
that was an excellent thing, and unfortunately it didn't turn out to be as great a record as it could have done. I think that there was a lot of infighting going on, and it kind of took second place in some fashion. But anyway, that's what it was. And then we got a call from Ozzy Osbourne to come down there, and that he came down there, and I think he was paying for that record himself as he got thrown out of Black Sabbath, and he was putting this whole new band together, which didn't really have a name at the time. And we did all go, oh yeah, Blizzard of Oz, yeah, well, and we all kind of looked at it and went, you know what, that's a pretty cheesy name. But it did come up a few times, and then I was really quite surprised when they ended up using it. And I thought, well, that's a typical American move, that is, isn't it? Pick up, some sort of, word play kind of thing, But I was like, oh, well, whatever, So it didn't seem to hurt him too much, though, did it?
No, not at all. And were you around for the recording of the demos for that album, or was it strictly for the actual album itself?
No. The first time I saw Ozzy was when he walked into the studio. I didn't even know it was Ozzy. Actually, I didn't recognize him. Not because he looked bad, just because I didn't really. It had been some time since I'd seen a picture of Ozzy. This was 1980, and probably the last picture I saw was on the Black Sabbath album, which I bought when I was, probably 10 years before.
And what kind of state was he in those days?
It wasn't too bad. He was, he's pretty young then, so, younger. So I think he's about 4 or 5 years older than me, but he wasn't in too bad a state. It was the 80s, so there was drinking and, whatnot going on. But for the most part, Ozzy was able to get the stuff done. And I was fortunate enough to hear those, the 24 tracks from those sessions much later because of one of the lawsuits where he was being sued for backward masking and all that stuff. I had to go up to BlackRock in New York, and a bunch of attorneys there and all this sort of stuff, and we had to reproduce what these people thought they heard. And actually, funnily enough, the story was I got up there and I said, look, I only had one delay. I had an AMS 1580 digital, and it only went to, in those days, memory, of course, very expensive. It was, back in the early days of digital stuff. So I think it only had 408 milliseconds delay. And so that being the longest delay that I could throw in there on the mixes, that was basically what it was. And that's how I remembered it. I said, well, I know it had to be, this, because that's as high as it went. I'm not sure if that's the exact number anymore, of course. But so we put that delay on, and I put it on stereo. So I went into one side, bounced out of the return into the other side, etc., and ping-ponged it into the track. And sure enough, it did really sound like, we soloed it up, and sure enough, it did really sound like he was saying something crazy backwards. But it was actually a combination of the echoes adding and repeating. So it was kind of an interesting thing. I was like, oh, holy moly. Yeah, it's pretty wild. So that's the story behind that. Actually, I think that lawsuit got dropped after that. They were like,
imagine so.
Yeah, because I said, look, it's just serendipitous. It wasn't, we weren't doing. The last thing Ozzy was doing was like being satanical. Yeah. He was being more, Scotchical or vodka-ical, than satanical. So, it just wasn't on the cards. So it was basically, that was a sort of non sequitur, really. So yeah, so we're lucky to do that record, of course. And Randy showed up, and he was that young thing and just ripping the stuff out. And he just practiced all the time. And I'd put a loop. These, you probably heard all these stories before, but I would make a loop of 15 seconds before and after the solo, and I would bounce that loop onto a 1/4-inch tape for him, and I'd get about 20 of them on there, so on a big long roll of tape, so he could just play it and have it go all the way through, and he could start and stop it, from where he was on the studio floor. So and then I would go to the pub for an hour or two, and then when we got back, sometimes he'd be ready, sometimes he'd just still be practicing. So
all his solos sounded very written.
Yeah, they were all pretty much written. The ones that weren't written are probably the stuff on the outros. A lot of those outros on those first couple of records were actually what he played on the backing track, and I was informed quite often by Ozzy to keep everything, always keep those backing tracks, because he used to love what Randy would play when it kind of wasn't written. So I guess you get the best of both worlds there. Really, you get some of his writing, and then you get some of his improvisation. So.
And what was the gap between the first two records? It seems like it was pretty tight. Was some of the recordings off the first sessions used on the second record?
No, it was a year apart, actually.
It was a year apart, yeah?
Yeah, and no, we made exactly the amount of songs. That's a question that comes up to me a lot, but we made almost exactly the amount of songs that were required. In fact, they had to come off the road a couple of times to cut B-sides for stuff, because they had singles but didn't have something they could put on the back. So there's a few tracks we did like that where they just came off of touring, and we were in the studio for a couple of days,
And what did you do between the first two records then? Were you working with other bands then?
Oh yeah, I was a resident engineer there, so we did. Let's see. Oh, I couldn't even remember. A lot of different bands down there. Let me see if I can remember any. One of the records I did down there was Box of Frogs with Paul Samwell Smith from the Yardbirds. And that was quite interesting, because on 5 of those tracks, Jeff Beck came down and played guitar. And I was astonished by Jeff Beck, of course, knowing full well who he was, of course. And but I didn't realize that Jeff Beck doesn't use a pick and has extraordinarily light strings. So I always wondered how he kind of got those bends and had that sort of fluidity, and then I realized how he was doing it. I was really astonished, and he was excellent, of course. Jeff Beck's still a fantastic player. I think he's just marvelous, and he has that great imagination, and he can play anything. That guy, just great. So that was interesting. Paul Samuel Smith, of course, from the Yardbirds. A couple of other guys, guitar players from the Yardbirds. The drummer, Jim. I can't remember his second name, but he was from the Yardbirds also. So that was a kind of an interesting little project. Sometimes I would go up to town and do some engineering in a couple of other places. That didn't happen too often. At the time, we were doing a lot of reggae too. We did a band called Matumbi. I did a record called that was quite successful with them in England, at least. I think it was called Zimbabwe, but I'm not sure if that was the name of the album. That was one of the tracks I remember. But Dennis Bovell, I think, was one of the guys that was working with them. He was producing, and they were a murder to work for. They would come in at like 7 in the morning, and they'd work till like 10 at night, and then they would walk out, and a bunch of new guys would walk in. So after about 32 hours, you're like, I gotta go to bed now. Sorry.
Yeah, no kidding. So for the second Ozzy record, how had things evolved for you? What was your role like, and what was his state of mind at that point?
Well, after the first record, they sort of they gave me a little more leeway. I mean, they weren't really in the studio when we were mixing the first record either. They were down by the pool, and I would do a mix, and then I'd run it onto a cassette, and then they would listen on a boombox, and then
Really?
they'd send back up with a couple of notes, and maybe this, do this, maybe this, maybe this. So it was actually pretty good for me. I didn't have to sit there and follow things by rote,
Sure.
And then the second one, they were nice enough to give me credit on that first record. So the second one had a little more hand in it. I knew the studio somewhat better at that point. We had a little more equipment.
And success off that first record, that's got to help things.
Yeah, although it wasn't really apparent in England that I'd had anything to do with that record. I mean, it didn't really affect me. I was just a resident engineer down there, and
Sure.
I didn't start getting phone calls really until maybe 83 or 84 about doing other people's records as production and engineering and stuff. So I was at Ridge Farm for about 4 years before any of that stuff sort of kicked in. Not really sure why, but probably people couldn't find me. I don't know.
But that whole time you were working nonstop.
Yeah, I was working the whole time down at Ridge Farm. Just a lot of different bands. Of course, as you mentioned before, having worked with Uriah Heep quite a lot, it was quite funny that Lee Kerslake would walk in and be the drummer for Ozzy Osbourne. So that of course, we were great friends already, so that was kind of funny. But that sort of helped, that it always helps to have, as you said before, it always helps to have a little bit of a connection there,
Yeah.
So there was, it just makes it so that, in the worst case, it makes it so you don't get replaced, at least. Or you don't get replaced quite as quickly.
Yeah.
So you get a bit more chance, you know what I mean?
In terms of the re-recording of the drums and bass on those records that happened later, and I think is now kind of been undone, and all the lawsuits and stuff. What are your thoughts on that stuff?
Well, I was aware that was going on. I was called by Sharon because they were having legalities and all this other stuff. I was called by Sharon. I was called by Sharon to about the viability of doing that. And actually, my answer was, look, I said, first of all, you're going to ruin the record. Yeah. And secondly, I really don't want to do it because I think those guys did a good job, and I think you're only doing it for political reasons, and I really don't want to, I don't really want to do it. And I heard that her father got pretty mad when he heard I said that. So they just went ahead and did it anyway. I think Tony Bon Jovi do it over at the power plant in New York.
Yeah, I'm not sure who actually did it, but I know they took a lot of shit for it.
Yeah, I mean, well, it was, the thing was, what I couldn't work out was that, I mean, look, you're going to, it's just a mechanical thing. It doesn't really have anything to do with the writing. Taking their performance off there doesn't change the publishing, which I thought the publishing was the major bugbear in that whole thing. So, I don't know. I wasn't really sure why they were doing it, and I didn't like it, and I thought it was a very bad move.
Yeah, it didn't seem to have anything to really do with the case, as opposed to a way of getting back at the people doing the lawsuit. You know, you sue us, fine, we'll take you off. It kind of felt like a knee-jerk reaction to that. That's how it seemed, anyway.
Yeah, maybe it doesn't. It didn't make a lot of sense to me, anyway. And I know that over the years they did take a lot of you know, they did take a lot of crap for it, and I was kind of pleased about that, because I thought that the original record stood on its own merits, and I thought it was good because, you know, that stuff does move around. It's not stuck to a tempo. There weren't any click tracks on it, so, you know, it was a pretty organic recording. And to try and replace that with stuff later on, it's you can never really get the same feel, and the solos don't sound as good because, you know, the way that Randy always played on top of the beat, and so if you try catching up with him, the whole sensibility of the music changes, and the sensibility of what he's playing changes too.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So I don't know how they did it. I don't know if I would have done it with them. I would have tempo mapped the original drums and had the guy play it to a click, and probably turn the other guys off, so that they could reproduce as closely as possible the original drums, you know, and the tempo movements that they made, and I think that would probably have worked better. But of course, it would always be a bit of a, you know, a turd polish anyway. But there you go. The other thing that annoyed me a little bit about that replacement business was that the mixes. Now most of those main solos were triple tracked, and there were very minor differences between those performances. And we took great care to make sure that the right one was slightly prevalent. And these are all little small things, but you know, when you take them into consideration and you take the sum of everything, you know, we took a lot of care with that stuff. We didn't have a lot of time, but we wanted to make sure that the right solo was up front. The other two solos were ghosted back just a certain amount, and that changes the solo. You know, if you use the wrong one, and I think they used on a few of those mixes, you know, so there are some slight, you know, things that Randy would not like to say, but wait a minute, that's not the right one. You're using the wrong solo up front there.
Right. So they would have had to do a full remix then to put those.
Oh, of course. You know, the whole thing changes quite a lot when you do that.
Yeah, I hadn't considered that. I was always thinking strictly about the performances and how it's changing the music, but you're really changing absolutely everything, including Randy. Yeah,
and I mean, you know, in those days, we weren't using automation on those mixes. It was all little pencil marks and moves like that. We didn't have Total Recall at that point on that console, so even recalling one of those mixes would have been next to impossible, even for me. In fact, on the second album, where they weren't even present for the mixing, they were back on tour. A couple of the mixes that I'd done as roughs, we ended up using them because I couldn't get them any better. And I said, Ozzy, look, I did a remix of this. Here's the remix. Here's the so-called, you know, good mix. But here's the demo one. The demo one was just, you know, for some reason, maybe Randy was a little louder. That's happened a few times, where the correct mix, you know, technically is not the right mix, you know. And you find that also on that the live album that I remixed, Tribute. The interesting story about that was that they sent me two cassettes of two different shows, and I listened to these two cassettes, and one of them was very kind of drab and a little boring and not very good, and the other one was really, you know, really quite exciting and a great show. And it actually turned out they were the same show with different mixes. And I analyzed, and I realized this after a while, because actually Randy made a couple of mistakes, and they were the same mistakes on both things. I'm like, well, he couldn't possibly have done that. So actually I analyzed the one that was really exciting, and I realized that Randy was probably a little too loud on it. But because he is very excited and playing live and playing in front, that sort of drags the whole track forward and gives it the excitement. So that was another eye opener that you know that could happen. You know that just timing and balance in the mix can make such a huge difference.
On that record, was it all from one show, or did you have a whole bunch of tapes to go through?
No, that was all one show. King Biscuit. A big King Biscuit reel, one of those big 12-inch reels running at 15 IPS. The whole show was on there, an hour and whatever it was, an hour and change. Yeah, it was just one big show, yeah.
And obviously, Randy was gone, but was there any touch-ups done by anybody else, or is that strictly a pure live album?
Now, I'm just thinking that, I thought you were going to ask me that question. There weren't any touch-ups, as far as I recall. Maybe, I think, I'm trying to remember whether we did any redid some vocals with Ozzy. That's possible. I really can't remember. I mixed that record at CBS in Columbus Circle in Manhattan, which was very nice because Bob Ludwig, the mastering engineer, is right around the corner, and I could send stuff around to him, and I had him come over and listen in the studio a couple of times, and we hung up a few blankets to correct the studio a little bit and stuff like that. So that was quite interesting. And there's a couple of pictures of myself and Ozzy in that studio, sitting at the console that you might have seen.
Yeah. Yep.
That was right towards the end of doing that project, and trying to think of any other notable stuff. Yeah, the other thing that happened on there was Ozzy got the mixes and he was pretty happy with them, but he said, you know what? He said, I'm just not hearing enough audience, so I had to I ran a few audience loops throughout the whole album, and did one pass throughout the whole record, riding in audience just everywhere I could. Mm-hmm. And you probably hear that. It's probably a bit over the top in some places, but that also was very intrinsic in making that much more exciting, and giving you a much more, much more of a feel that you're really there. So that was quite an astute remark from Ozzy. He's like, I'm not hearing enough audience. So I'm like, okay.
Now, in terms of Ozzy himself, I tend to feel that he doesn't get quite the credit he deserves, because he may not be much of a lyricist, but people equate that to not writing the vocal melody. And it seems he always writes his own vocal melodies, and then he often, I think now he may write some lyrics, but back then he had other people tend to just put the words for him. Was that the case?
Yeah, that's pretty much the case. Yeah, I mean, most of the words weren't written on those two records until we got into the studio. So they had a few bits, they had a few bits and pieces. Bob Daisley wrote pretty much all of the lyrics on those two first records. Ozzy helped him a little bit here and there, and he'd go, "Yeah, I like that," and he'd go, "Nah, I don't like that," and but certainly nobody else was writing melody lines. That's Ozzy through and through.
And to me, I'm not a lyrics guy, so I don't give a shit what they say, as long as I like the vocal performance and I like the melodies. So for me, I think that was, Ozzy really contributed there.
Well, sure. I mean, if you look at publishing, half of it is the melody line and half of it is the words. So, Ozzy is certainly at least a 50% contributor to the writing of those songs. And people moan about, I saw recently, the guys from the Police moaning about, the fact that he did the guitar part for Every Step You Take, and he never got, any publishing. Well, you don't get publishing for that. Yeah. You don't get publishing for a good guitar part. It just doesn't happen. So that, I think that, whether that's the right way to go for publishing, I'm not really sure. Obviously some things are more intrinsic than others, but that's just the way it was at the time. So, it legally, anyway, Ozzy was definitely half wrote all that stuff at least. So
now for Bark at the Moon, that was your last Ozzy record, correct?
Bark at the Moon, yes. Well, we did the other stuff afterwards. I did the Bark at the Moon, and then
Tribute.
Later on, with that Tribute. And I did the Black Sabbath thing that Ozzy did also. The
Speak of the Devil?
Yes, correct, yeah.
I think that's the album where Ozzy puts in his liner notes that I'm retiring the Sabbath songs.
Yeah, my understanding of that situation was that he owed Jet Records a couple of records, and so he wanted to get that done and legally out of the way, so basically picked up that band with Brad Gillis and... I forget who was drumming, and was it Tommy on that? I can't remember.
I think it was Tommy on that, and I think Rudy Sarzo on bass.
Yeah, it was Rudy on bass, yeah. Yeah, so that was actually, we got that record done very, very quickly. We went downtown in Manhattan and did 2 shows, I believe 2 shows at, I forget the venue, some big hall, about 2,500 seater. And I said to Ozzy, look, why don't we, we don't know, we've only got a limited amount of live materials, as far as how many shows you're going to do. And normally with a live record, you like to have a few different shows so you can cut over to something else if somebody screws up or, it's not a particularly good performance. So I said, look, why don't we record the whole thing in the afternoon? And then I got a backup if I need to substitute something, or if I need to go pick something up, we can, maybe we can cut it in, or at least we'll have a bit of insurance.
Sure.
So we did do that. We recorded the whole thing the afternoon before that show, I think. And in fact, I believe there are 4 or 5 songs on that record that we did take from the afternoon performance, which was to an empty hall. So I had to correct the ambience, because I had to put people into the ambience basically to absorb, so of course the ambient mics I had to change the EQ on them and dull them out a bit, and I had to add audience and try to match them up to the actual, sound on the live show itself. But I think there's 4 or 5 of those tracks actually came from the afternoon performances, and we kind of, switched them in there.
The myth of the live album has kind of been, removed. People tend to understand now that not all live albums are necessarily live, but it's still live in its own way. What kind of touch-ups and whatnot were done on that?
We redid all the vocals, I think, on that Black Sabbath thing. So which you could probably tell. So we did it in a real hurry. It was mixed, and we did the vocals and mixed it in 4 days. And I think there's 4 sides to that record. It's a double album. So I did it up at the record plant, and I mixed it. I hated the main speakers in there, so I mixed it on a pair of Auratones. And as we got to the third side, they were already mastering the first side over in another part of the building there. So we had that album. We had that album recorded, dubbed, cut, mixed, and mastered in probably about a week.
And how do you feel about it now, looking back at it?
Actually, it's not bad. I don't mind it. It's not that bad. I mean, there's a few faults, but I mean, I think it does the job. It's not a bad. I mean, it's worth listening to. So,
Yeah, I've always liked it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I always thought it was good. I didn't really like having to do it that fast. Nobody likes having to work that quickly, but in a way, you kind of get it done, and it stands up with its own faults, and what can you do? That was the situation. So I think it's okay. I think it's worth listening to. I think Brad played well on it, and Rudy perhaps not so well, but I know Ozzy was asking about, well, should we do this with the bass, or should we do this? And I'm like, let's just get on with it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I didn't want to start trying to track bass in on that. It just becomes a whole can of worms, and I just really didn't want to go there. We didn't have time, and so I said, come on, let's just move on.
Now tell me a little bit about A Bark at the Moon, and all of a sudden Randy's gone, and now you've got Jake in there. What was that experience like with Jake, and how was Ozzy doing at that point?
Well, Ozzy was a bit of a mess, as I recall. Jake was trying very hard. He's a great player. We tried very hard. Of course, there was a bit of a shadow over that whole album because of the Randy thing, and we kind of ran out of money at Ridge Farm due to taking a little longer. There were some big shoes to fill there, so things were taking somewhat longer. Jake wasn't obviously as in tune with that band as Randy had been, so there was a bunch of catching up to do, I think, on his part. Not that he didn't do an excellent job, but certainly it was a tough job for him. It was kind of a tough job for me too. We ran out of money. We flew to New York to mix it. Ozzy didn't really like those mixes, so he fired me and got, I think, Tony Bon Jovi over at the record plant to mix it. I didn't really like those mixes either. I didn't particularly like mine either, but there you go. You know, once again, that was like a 3 or 4 day mix, so it really wasn't enough time to do it justice, I thought. But that's par for the course. Getting fired by Ozzy and Sharon is it's probably just another honor that you have to appreciate.
Yeah, that's a badge of honor right there for sure.
Yeah, well, they fired me a few times. I mean, and then after that they called me back to do the other couple of things. So really, it wasn't as sordid as it could have been.
Yeah, obviously you've worked with so many artists that we don't have time to touch upon all of them. But a personal favorite of mine that you've done is the Lynch Mob record.
Yes. A couple of funny stories about that is actually I was approached by a guy over in New York at Atco. I can't remember his name. But he called me up and said, I got this band down in Texas I want you to listen to. And I said, okay. So I flew down to Texas and listened to this band, and I thought they were excellent. But they didn't have a manager, and they didn't have an agency, and they didn't have a record deal. So I flew back to New York, and I said to the guy at Atco, which is, is an Atlantic subsidiary at that time, I said, look, I think the band's great. I think you got a real winner. Let's, but I can't do it unless I have management, and I can't do it unless you're going to give them a deal, because, it's just won't be worth my while. And, in those days, you really had to have support. You had to get the studio paid for and all that kind of stuff. So he said, fine. So actually, my manager at the time, Andy Gould, picked up that band, and he managed them for a while. The band was Pantera.
I was wondering.
So right at the end of that whole scenario, when I was going to go down there and work with Phil Anselmo and all those guys, I got a call from the West Coast that George had this new band and was making this record. And I was a huge fan of George Lynch's. And for one reason or another, I had to choose one or the other, so I chose George. I mean, that probably was a bad decision because Pantera made a lot more money than Lynch Mob. But at the time, you go with your gut. So I wanted to work with George. I knew him, and I knew the drummer.
Yeah, Mick Brown.
I knew those guys pretty well. I'd hung out with those guys before. So so we went down. We started doing that. I guess that was 1990. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking.
Yeah, that's about right.
And we went to One-on-One in Burbank, and we brought in a big PA from Electrosound to record with as a drum monitoring system. We had lots of guitars there. I had a guitar rig set up with a programmable equalizer so we could equalize all the guitars the same, because George loves to change guitars in the middle of a solo and stuff like that. So we had to make sure that we could accommodate all that kind of thing. And of course, there was a lot of attendant going backwards and forwards with Oni Logan singing, who wasn't very happy. He was much happier really kind of singing in a demo studio.
Yeah.
And it was difficult for him to make that transition.
Why do you think that was? Was it the pressure?
Yeah, maybe. I think the pressure got to him a lot, and it was difficult for him to perform, as naturally as he normally could. I mean, the guy's a great singer, so I don't really understand it. But also, George didn't want me particularly doing performances with vocals. For some reason, he thought that I wasn't the best guy for that. So we started that record with myself and Neil Kernan producing.
Oh, okay.
And I was recording the basic tracks, doing the drums and all that stuff, because George thought that I would do a sonically better job of it. And Neil was actually working with Oni Logan, and he actually went into a different room and did some vocals with Oni, and then he would go to a different studio and sometimes with Oni, and he was having a real bad time with Oni. He couldn't get the vocals he wanted. He was trying to work with Oni, and it wasn't going that well, and we were getting really quite worried. So I had already the whole set of 8 tracks that they made for the demos. So a lot of the vocals on there were really good. Unfortunately, they were sung in a different key, and the tempos were not the same. So I had to build a spreadsheet and map those vocals onto the newer performances that we recorded. Because I said to George at one point, I said, look, George, you know, this is getting a little dangerous. We don't have any vocals on like a bunch of these songs. And they said, they're not coming in that quick. I said, so we have to have a plan B, you know. So I said, look, these vocals on the 8-track are great. Let me fly these over. At least we'll have them. And then if Oni can get a better vocal, fine. You know, because that's really what producing's all about, is making sure that at the end of the day you got a record, you know.
Yeah.
I went into the back room at Skip Saylor and took a few days and took all these tracks of Oni's and line by line retuned them and retimed them and dropped them into the main tracks. And I think there's 4 or 5 tracks on there, or maybe 4 tracks on there that have the original vocals that we didn't perceive that he was getting them any better. And actually that's really a truism. You can ask any engineer, producer, or even artist, that a lot of the times you don't get it any better than the first time you hit it, you know. And you got to be ready to try and grab that all the time. And of course, it's a lot easier now because you've got technology. You can retune something. You don't have to throw a line out because it's out of tune. You know, you can fix it. So, I mean, fixing stuff got better. And at that time, I was actually doing a lot of fixing on a lot of records as far as tuning vocals. But I wasn't doing them with auto-tune. I was doing them with a manual process where I would hand tune them myself. It would take a long time. It would take 8 or 10 hours per vocal to go through it and just pop it into the right context. But
that sounds like misery. That sounds like misery compared to how it would be now.
It is, but you know, at the end of the day, when you can take that vocal and put it anywhere you want in the mix and it works, that's the reward that you get. Because if the vocal's out of tune, you got to bring it up on top. Otherwise, it starts to get a little nasty. So, you know, you get limited in how you can mix, and a lot of production is like that. There's only a certain way you can mix stuff unless you get all the kinks out of it. And that record, we took a lot of time and care to get rid of the kinks so we could mix it how we wanted it to sound, you know.
Now that sound on that record, it's very different than Dokken. It's very bluesier, it's earthier. The tone of it is completely different. How much of a design was that before you even started? How did that come about? Because Lynch never sounded that way before. No, well, that's my ears on it, really. That's how I hear it. I just wanted it. I wanted that kind of sound, and that's just, you know, how I did it. And I guess George started hearing it like that, and he was like, "Yeah, this is great. This is how I want it to sound." So. It probably never sounded like that with Dokken because that was Michael Wagner, and he doesn't mix the same way I do, you know. Right. Now, on the next Lynch Mob album, which I know you didn't do, but they went back to more of a Dokken-y kind of drier sound, and it didn't work. And now, you know, and ever since then, Lynch has been in every interview talking about it, saying how much he regrets not continuing the sound that you guys created on that first Lynch Mob record. Well, the thing with the first Lynch Mob record, we were all very pleased with it when it came out. I got Ron Nevison calling me up saying how great he thought it was. I mean, that's the first time that sort of thing's ever happened, really, that quickly. I think he called me up the morning it came out and said, this is a really great sounding record. So I got a lot of compliments on that. We worked on it very hard, and it cost a lot of money. Not particularly because of the way it sounds, but it costs a lot of money because of the vocal stuff. We had to go back out to Arizona and record, and then I came back to one-on-one to mix, and
we were getting very close to the release date, so Dave Thoner mixed a couple of tracks, and then we didn't like one of the ones that he did, so I had to go and remix that again. So it was a very expensive record, and we went over budget, and Elektra weren't very happy about that, and I think that left a bit of a bad taste in George's mouth, and he probably wanted to do something else because he wanted to get away from that whole experience. It was a very trying experience making that record, even though it was very enjoyable. It took a long time, and it was a lot of work. But, you know, I mean, we all loved it. But I think that at the end of the day, he was like, probably the record label said, well, you can't use that guy again because he cost us too much money, you know.
And also, it was successful, but it wasn't Dokken successful. It
didn't really have any pop songs on it. And Dokken is more pop-oriented, so, you know, or sort of middle of the AOR kind of deal. So, you know, it was a tougher record than that. So I wouldn't have expected it to sell as many because it really didn't have a sort of a Into the Fire or, you know, one of those hits there. I mean, Wicked Sensation was probably the biggest hit on it. There was a couple other ones that were conceivable. I think what let the record down was the touring, though.
Oh, how so?
We did sell almost 1 million copies of that record, I think, and probably more since then. I mean, I don't know what it's like now, but now that's really pretty respectable. And then they went out to start touring, and I think the touring just fell apart. I think they were unable to recreate it. I think Oni was having problems doing the vocals on the road as well. I went to see them at the Whiskey when they started the tour, and it wasn't a great show, and it wasn't very coherent. There was a lot of talking in between songs, and it just wasn't for the sound of that record. They needed to be a lot slicker and a lot more stadium-like, and I don't think that for some reason that didn't happen. And I don't know whether it was a lack of tour support, lack of a rehearsal, but I wasn't very enamored of their live show when I saw it. Admittedly, it was very early on.
ABC had a concert series. It was called In Concert at that time, and Lynch Mob were on it, and Oni had a real bad night, and it was a very nasally performance. Something was wrong, and within a couple months after that, aired nationally, he was gone. You know, I think that was the kind of nail in the coffin.
Yeah, I don't know what the deal was. I did try and do a couple of vocals with him. He softened up a little towards the end, and we started getting some stuff. We went back to the demo studio that he worked at in Arizona, and we got some stuff going like that. But yeah, it was very tough. It was like it was like pulling nails trying to get those vocals. And as I said before, you know, we actually never got them all. We had to use the ones off the demos. And I didn't mind that because I loved them anyway, so it didn't matter to me.
Yeah, the vocals on the record are great. And you know what? I saw Oni sing 3 weeks ago, and he sounded fantastic. He was doing the Dio Disciples thing, and he sounded great and really powerful voice. And so all's good with Oni, I think.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what happened. I always thought he was a great singer. I love the way he sings. I really like the way he sings. I think the guy could be one of the best singers out there. And I never really understood what the problems were. And I wasn't actually in there doing the vocals most of the time, so I, never really got close enough to really figure out what the problem was. And that's just the way it is. I mean, but I was just happy that we got the vocals on that record, and that the record came out almost exactly how I wanted to hear it. I mean, I still listen to that record too. It's I think it's a real good achievement on everybody's behalf. So. Yeah, I think it's a great record. And I was a little bummed out that George never called me back, and he never said, "Hey, let's do another one." You know what I mean? I don't think that I really deserve that. But people change, record companies change. People want to make a change, they move on. So that's just the way it is. I mean, when we got to Arizona, Neil Kernan was going to go into the studio with Oni, and he found out that Oni was already in the studio with his original demo engineer guy. And he got very pissed off, and he said, "Just take me to the airport. I'm leaving." So
wow.
I took him to the airport, and I drove over to the studio, and George was there, and I said, Neil left. He's gone. So I said, you give me, some of his points, and let's move on. So that was, I mean, there was some stuff going on like that, and it was a big budget record. George was a big star at that point. It was a big star kind of cast. So, there's a little politics going on and stuff. Who knows?
Oh, there always is.
Yeah, there's always some politics going on.
Let's move on into Megadeth. Obviously, you did a few records with them.
I used to do a lot of work over at Rumbo Recorders in Burbank, which I think is still there. It was the Captain and Tennille's studio. I used to do a lot of work over there. I think I did. I can't remember what bands I did over there. Dangerous Toys, maybe I did over there, and a bunch of bands like that. But Megadeth were over there recording Rust in Peace, and they were doing it with Mike Klink. And I know Mike Klink, not particularly well, but I do know him. I've met him a few times, and we've shared a couple of beers or whatever. And he got a call from Guns N' Roses to do the next record after Appetite for Destruction. So of course he's not going to turn that down, obviously. No. So I got a phone call saying, look, these guys, there's no points in it. It's not a lot of money, but these guys, they want you to mix a record because Mike Klink can't do it. So I went over there and played a game of pool with them, and that's how that all started.
So you weren't involved in any of the sessions then? It was you came in at for post-production and did the mixing?
That's right, yes. They gave me, basically, we took the tapes over to, once again, one-on-one. I mixed in the front room at one-on-one, and I would bring the stuff up. There wasn't a lot of stuff to fix. There was quite a lot of edits that caused me to have to flip channels on the snare because the snare would go dead in certain places, and I would have to change the EQ on it. So there was quite a lot of sort of tidying up in the mix, but I didn't really do any engineering with them. It was just really mixing. And Dave would come in every day. I would play him the track. We'd make a few changes, and we'd put it down and move on. So that was pretty painless, really.
But obviously, it worked well enough that for Countdown, you were brought in as a full producer.
Yes, Dave wanted to learn how to produce more, I think. So he saw me as a bit of a mentor. We've been friends for quite a while anyway, Dave and I. So he was like, well, let me co-produce it with you. And I said, look, if you want to put your name on there, that's fine. Whatever you want to do. I said, and I'll show you what I can. You just have to. I mean, I said, it doesn't come out of a book, so I can't give you lessons. But I said, if you just, if you hang around and watch what's going on, then I'm sure you'll, get the, it'll give you what you want. So that's basically how we did it. Countdown, I did go in and do all the rehearsals with them. That was a very well-arranged record. Dave sent me, actually, the story about getting that gig is Dave sent me a cassette with all the stuff that he had on it, and I sat there and listened to it, and there weren't really, there was some vocals, not a lot of vocals, some stuff in there, and I was listening to it and I couldn't figure out what to do with it, and normally that just means that you haven't listened to it enough. So I just kept listening to it, and after about a week I thought, well, look, I got to get back to this guy who's just going to move on. So I wrote out excuse me, I wrote out a lot of notes, pages and pages of notes, like a page on each song of where I thought it should go, what I thought he should do with the arrangement, what I would cut out, what I would add, what I would try rewrite, whatever. And I was really pretty brutal, as I recall. And I thought, but I was honest, the only, there's nobody's gonna give you shit for being honest. They might not like it,
but they'll respect it.
That's the job. So anyway, so I sent him all these notes, and I didn't hear back for a few days. And I thought, oh well, there goes that gig's not coming in.
Yeah.
And then one day I was at my house I lived in Studio City at the time, and I got a phone call from Dave, and my wife said, "Oh, Dave Mustaine's on the phone." So I pick up the phone. I say, "Hey," he said, "Yes, I read all your notes." And there was this big pause, and I said, "Okay, good." And he said, "I agree with about 99% of them."
Oh.
So I said, "Well, okay, that's very good. I'm glad." Because I thought he was going to say, "You're an asshole," and just hang up.
Yeah.
But he said, "So let's put this thing together." So we put it together, and we just trying to remember. We did that in the Enterprise in Burbank, an excellent studio, really more well known for its mixing than its tracking, but there was enough space in there to do the tracking. And as I recall, that is the first record that we used digital machines on. I think we used the Sony 24 tracks over there. And that was part and parcel of us trying to make it really a very accurate record.
That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, it was made to be very accurate. I had developed some 2 or 3 studio practices where, for instance, window punching we used extensively on that for the solos, where I can just pop them in and out for maybe about 200 milliseconds just to fix one note in a solo, and just do it repeatedly until we get it right. We had a lot of techniques like that I'd been honing over the years that we began to use on that record. Also used a lot of vocal correction stuff, tuning. I said to Dave, I said, "Listen, I want you in tune. I want you bang in tune." I said, "You can be as rough as you want, and you can be as out there as you want, but I said, you're going to be exactly in tune." And he said, "Well, I don't really know what you mean." I said, "Okay, well, here's the before and here's the after." And he heard it and he said, "Okay, what do I have to buy you to do this on the whole record?" And I said, "Okay, you got to buy me this big hard drive, because I need to get the stuff on and off the machine and into the processor, and etc., etc." So he said, "Fine." So he bought me one right there at the studio. He bought me this what he calls a gigabit drive, which is actually a 1 gigabyte drive, I think.
Oh, that must have been a fortune back then.
Oh yeah, it was. It was about $2,800, I think. It was a SCSI drive too, so it was very expensive. It came out of the Synclavia room over there. So after that, we then started to get really very, very nitpicky about all the performances, and that's the result that you hear. There is quite a bit of serendipitousness though in that record. We did some other tracks as well for soundtracks, like Angry Again, for instance, where he didn't really know what to do with that chorus at the back end, and he was like kind of pissed off that he didn't know what to do, so he just went angry again, ah! And I said, "It's perfect." I said, "That's it, it's perfect." And he said, "What are you got to be kidding." I said, "Listen to it." And he goes, "Yeah, okay." So that's how we fixed up that song. I mean, those things happen, and you just got to say, "Oh yeah, I like that. That's good." And you try and keep stuff that grabs you. That's part of the whole job.
Yeah. Well, he seems like such a intelligent guy and a bit of a control freak, but he seems like if he respects you, then he'll let you do what you want to do.
Well, I think that's true of anybody. When you're dealing with musicians, singers, guitar players, anybody really, there's always some ego there. You got to stand your ground, and you got to be honest. If you try and flim flam around, then you're not going to get anywhere. And that's really what they want. They don't want somebody to kiss their ass. Yeah. They want somebody to come and say, "No, that's not good enough. You could do better than that." That part sucks. Let's get rid of that part. It's horrible. And they look at you and they're like, you can see them thinking, what an asshole. But they go, "You know what? Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe the guy's right." So you have to, and so I think Dave respects that. I mean, I respect Dave too. He is who he is, and he is a very, very smart guy.
Yeah.
He's also a big wine cellar now, I just saw.
Oh, really? I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, he sold out his entire wine stock, I think, in like 3 days, which is pretty cool. He has a vineyard now, so.
Oh, I didn't know. Now on Youthanasia, like obviously Countdown was a huge record. It wasn't Black Album by Metallica huge, and it did feel like a little bit of a reaction to that record, but it was a very big record. How had things changed when it was time to do the next one, Youthanasia?
Well, Youthanasia, I think that we deliberately slowed it down a bit. You have to remember the timing in the music business at the time. When Youthanasia was being made, all of the other stuff was disappearing. It was all about Nirvana and grunge.
Yeah, for sure. This is 94.
Yeah, so the whole musical horizon had changed. And I wanted him to reflect at least some of that change and try and keep some melodies in there. And, you know, at least maybe we slowed the tempos down somewhat. And, you know, that was a reaction to the times. I mean, all records are a reaction to the current times. So, yes, that was somewhat of a reaction. Indeed, as the first one was, of course, a reaction to the Black Album by Metallica. I mean, you know, Dave has always sort of, you know, been on the attack against Metallica ever since he got fired. So, you know, that's always part of Dave's agenda, I think, you know.
Did you read his book?
No, I didn't.
It's an interesting read. It is an interesting read. And it pretty much confirms everything as a fan that I suspected in terms of his personality. He didn't really, he seemed pretty honest about it all.
Yeah, he's an honest guy. I don't think that Dave doesn't pull any punches. He's an honest guy. He doesn't, you know, he doesn't try, you know, people think that he tries to manipulate them, but he really doesn't. He's just a smart guy, and he's an original thinker, you know, so that's just the way he is.
For that next record, how had technology changed? Like if Countdown was the first digital, you know, things move fast. Within a couple of years, had the technology evolved a lot to keep on doing it digital?
Well, the story about Youthanasia was that Dave had moved to Arizona, and he wanted to record the record in Arizona, as he was having a few little indulgence problems at the time, and so. I went out there to try and find a studio, and there's really only one studio in Phoenix that's any good. And we didn't like the guy that ran it, and he tried to charge us a fortune because he saw whatever, he saw the, you know, the writing on the wall, as it were. So what I did, I countered to the band with a programmable analog console that I had been working on for a couple of years. With programmable equalizers and these digital analog controllers. The software for that was almost written, and it turned out that I had manufacturing problems with the people that were going to build the boards. And the original concept was to go out there, build a studio, or actually record in a house and try and grab everything as it went down, as opposed to, you know, rehearsing, whatever. So the original setup was going to be this analog console, which was all digitally controlled, MIDI controlled actually, and we were going to use two 16-track Pro Tools rigs to record with. And due to the fact that I got the rigs out there and we were testing them, and they worked great, except when you had all 16 tracks in record, they would glitch out occasionally. We found out eventually it was a bug with the grey matter driver that Pro Tools used to use. So at that point, we kind of rejected that idea, and we brought in a Sony 48-track digital machine, which is perfect, very, very good workhorse. And had plenty of space to do stuff, and we could do all our window punching and all our accuracy stuff, and it was very conducive, you know, technology. And I bought an SSL console actually from Manhattan. It was the one that I think quite a few people have made hit records on. Steve Winwood's High Life was made on this console.
Oh, cool.
So I put that console and brought it in. We built the studio in Arizona, which I designed. I learned AutoCAD and designed the studio. And that's how that went down. We did a lot of rehearsing, and then we went in Arizona, and then we went to this place in the south of Phoenix that was just basically a warehouse, and we built the studio there and did the record.
Take us up now to today. Obviously, the technology's evolved amazingly to the point now where you can do a lot of stuff on a laptop. What's life like for Max Norman now? What are you working on?
Well, last year I mixed a record for... I haven't been doing music stuff for a while because my kids were growing up. I wanted to be around for them and all that kind of stuff. Now they're in college, so I have more time. So I'm starting to do more music stuff. Mostly you can do a lot of stuff in the box. Actually, I did this record last year with Ethan Broche, which I think just came out. You can go listen to that one. That actually sounds pretty good. That's I actually mixed that up at the Carriage House in Stamford, Connecticut. We spent a week up there, or actually probably about 10 days, and I mixed it on the SSL up there. But that was all Pro Tools source material, so that makes things a lot easier. You can get in and fix stuff and tweak stuff around without having to do too much. Without having to jump through too many hoops. So it's a little bit different way of working, but it all just comes out the same pipe, in the end. And now I mix at my house. I'm mixing a record now for a band called Machine Age, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, from Brazil. I'm just starting to mix these guys, actually. I did one mix last week. I'm actually going to go start mixing in a couple of hours. So I use a very minimal setup here. I have all the different doors, so I can choose whether I want to use Pro Tools or whether I want to use Reaper or whether I want to use Logic or Cubase. In fact, actually, this current record I'm using an older version of Cubase, which has all the required plugins. I have a lot of SSL plugins and Waves plugins, all that kind of stuff. So. It's really, for me, it's pretty much the same process. I just try and get what I want, and I keep messing with everything until I get what I want. I'm lucky that I know what I want to hear, and so how I get there, it doesn't matter to me. I'm actually glad that there's no more analog. It used to be a real pain for me to try and keep things bright and clean and how I wanted them. I was much more tuned to the whole digital thing when it came around than analog. Analog to me was always a not as good medium. Although a lot of people, they like it and they like all the dirt and all that other stuff. But to me, there's plenty of distortion everywhere else. I don't need to put it on the tape,
Yeah.
And now it's easy. I mean, you can make records on an iPad now, and it sounds better than it used to those days. So
I know, and that still blows my mind. There it is, my conversation with Max Norman. Awesome guy, lots of great stories. It was really fun to talk to him. Join us next week when we've got a conversation with somebody you probably haven't heard of, but really probably should have. That's next Monday at thedoublestop.com, on iTunes, on YouTube, on Spreaker. Lots of places you can find the show, so don't miss it.